The yellow barrier arm dropped like a guillotine between Captain Marcus Thompson and the place he'd once called home. 6 years of nightmares, therapy sessions, and sleepless nights had led to this moment, standing at the gates of Whitman Air Force Base with his service dog Ranger at his side, watching a young airman shake his head with practiced indifference. "I don't care what you think you earned," Sergeant Jake Rodriguez said, his voice cutting through the Kansas morning air. "Your name's not on the list, and your status shows complications. Turn around and go home." Marcus felt his chest tighten, the familiar weight of rejection settling on his shoulders like an old coat he couldn't take off. But then, from across the parking lot, a voice rang out sharp and clear, cutting through the humid air like a command that couldn't be ignored. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you will step away from that gate right now and bring Captain Thompson to my office immediately." The voice belonged to Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a woman Marcus had never met, but whose rank insignia caught the morning sun like a beacon. Everyone froze. The barrier arm trembled between them, and for the first time in 6 years Marcus dared to hope that someone might finally listen. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Marcus Thompson had been awake since 3 in the morning, not because he wanted to be, but because sleep had become a luxury he could rarely afford. The nightmares always came in the dark, hours before dawn, pulling him from whatever peace he'd managed to find, back into the dust and chaos of forward operating Base Phoenix. 6 years had passed since Afghanistan, 6 years since Operation Enduring Shield, and 6 years since the incident that had changed everything. But today was different. Today was Meritorious Service Recognition Day at Whitman Air Force Base, and for the first time since his discharge, Marcus had decided to return. The drive from his small apartment in Prairie View had taken 47 minutes, winding through endless fields of corn and wheat that stretched toward a horizon he'd once thought represented freedom. Now it just felt like distance, mile after mile of space between who he used to be and who he'd become. Ranger, his German Shepherd service dog, sat quietly in the passenger seat of his weathered pickup truck, sensing the tension that radiated from Marcus like heat from summer asphalt. The dog's presence was both comfort and reminder, a living symbol of how far he'd fallen and how hard he'd fought to climb back up. Marcus had dressed carefully that morning, putting on his cleanest jeans and a navy blue polo shirt that brought out his eyes. He'd polished his old combat boots until they gleamed, not because regulations required it, but because some habits die hard. Around his neck hung his dog tags, worn smooth by years of nervous handling, and in his wallet sat a folded piece of paper that had arrived 3 weeks earlier. The invitation to Meritorious Service Recognition Day had come through the American Legion Post 247, a simple cardstock announcement that veterans and their families were welcome to attend a ceremony honoring those who had served with distinction in recent conflicts. For weeks, Marcus had stared at that invitation, reading and rereading the elegant script that promised recognition, honor, and belonging. Dr. Amanda Foster, his VA counselor, had encouraged him to go, saying it might help with what she delicately called his reintegration challenges. Marcus knew what she really meant. He'd been struggling to find his place in a world that seemed to have moved on without him, working part-time at Henderson's hardware store and spending his evenings at the Sunflower Diner, watching other people live lives that felt as foreign to him as the surface of Mars. The decision to attend hadn't been easy. For 6 years, Marcus had avoided anything that might connect him to his military service, anything that might trigger questions he wasn't ready to answer. His discharge papers were filed away in a drawer he rarely opened, and he'd declined every invitation to veteran gatherings, reunion dinners, and memorial services. But something about this invitation felt different, maybe because it spoke of meritorious service rather than sacrifice, maybe because Dr. Foster had been particularly insistent, or maybe because Marcus was finally tired of running from who he used to be. As he'd driven through the Kansas countryside that morning, Marcus had allowed himself to imagine what the day might bring. Perhaps he'd see old friends from his combat aviation brigade. Perhaps someone would remember the missions they'd flown together, the lives they'd saved, the brotherhood they'd shared. Perhaps, for just one day, he could remember what it felt like to belong somewhere, to be part of something larger than his small apartment, and his part-time job, and his careful routine of therapy appointments and sleepless nights. The first sign that things might not go as planned came when he turned into the base entrance and saw the heightened security presence. Multiple checkpoints had been established, barriers that hadn't existed during his years of service, and a line of vehicles waited for inspection. Marcus took his place in the queue, watching as each car ahead of him was thoroughly examined, IDs checked and rechecked, purposes questioned and documented. When his turn finally came, he rolled down his window and handed over his driver's license, along with the invitation that had brought him here. Sergeant Jake Rodriguez was young, probably early 20s, with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of recent basic training and unwavering adherence to protocol. He examined Marcus's license with the intensity of someone checking for state secrets, then turned his attention to the invitation. His expression, which had been professionally neutral, slowly shifted towards something that looked suspiciously like suspicion. "Captain Thompson," Rodriguez said, and the way he pronounced the rank made it sound like a question rather than a statement. "I need to verify your authorization to be on this base. Please wait here while I make some calls." Marcus felt the first flutter of unease in his stomach, but he nodded and waited as Rodriguez retreated to his security booth. Through the window, he could see the young sergeant making phone calls, his expression growing more serious with each conversation. Other vehicles were waved through without incident, families dressed in their Sunday best heading toward what Marcus could see were festivities already underway on the base. Children with small American flags ran between the cars, and the sound of a military band drifted across the morning air. After 15 minutes, Rodriguez returned, but his demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the professional courtesy, replaced by something harder, more official. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of your vehicle," he said, his hand resting casually on his radio. "There seems to be some discrepancy with your records." Marcus felt his throat tighten, but he complied, climbing out of his truck with Ranger immediately jumping down beside him. The dog sensed his distress and moved closer, offering the comfort of warm fur against his leg. "What kind of discrepancy?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Rodriguez consulted a clipboard that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. "According to our database, your discharge status shows administrative separation under questionable circumstances. There's a flag on your record that prevents base access without prior authorization from the commanding officer." He looked up from his clipboard with eyes that held no sympathy. "I don't care what you think you earned, Captain. Your name's not on the list, and your status shows complications. Turn around and go home." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, each syllable driving deeper than the last. Questionable circumstances, administrative separation, complications. The euphemisms that had followed him for 6 years, the careful language that reduced his service, his sacrifice, his brothers in arms to a series of bureaucratic complications. He felt his hands begin to shake, not with fear, but with a rage that had been building for years, fed by sleepless nights and unanswered questions, and the growing certainty that the system he'd served had abandoned him. "There's been a mistake," Marcus said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I was invited to this ceremony. I served honorably for 8 years. I flew missions in Afghanistan, saved lives, did everything that was asked of me and more." Rodriguez's expression didn't change. "Sir, I'm just following protocol. If you have issues with your discharge status, you'll need to take that up with the appropriate authorities. For now, I need you to return to your vehicle and leave the premises." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation that had plagued him since Afghanistan, the feeling that the walls were closing in and the air was getting thin. But this time, instead of retreating, instead of accepting the judgment and walking away, something inside him rebelled. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "Not until someone explains to me why a veteran who served his country for 8 years isn't welcome at a ceremony honoring veterans." The standoff that followed felt like it lasted forever, though in reality it was probably only minutes. Other cars continued to pass through the checkpoint, their occupants casting curious glances at the scene unfolding at the side of the road. Marcus stood his ground, Ranger pressed against his leg while Rodriguez made more phone calls and summoned backup. Soon, Marcus found himself surrounded by 3 security personnel, all of them young enough to be his little brother, all of them looking at him like he was a potential threat rather than someone who had once worn the same uniform they wore. It was Master Sergeant Lisa Chen who first approached with something resembling respect. She was older than the others, probably in her 40s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of experience rather than just training. "Captain Thompson," she said, and the way she used his rank suggested she understood what it meant. "I'm Master Sergeant Chen. I understand there's been some confusion about your base access." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone who spoke to him like a human being rather than a problem to be solved. "There's no confusion on my end, Sergeant," he replied. "I received an invitation to attend today's ceremony. I'm a veteran, and as far as I know, I have every right to be here." Chen nodded thoughtfully, studying the paperwork that Rodriguez had accumulated. "I can see the invitation, sir, and I can see your service record. 8 years, multiple deployments, commendations for valor." She paused, and Marcus could see her wrestling with something. "But I'm also seeing flags in the system that I don't understand. Flags that were placed there after your discharge." "What kind of flags?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that suggest there were questions about your final mission," Chen said carefully. "Questions that apparently were never fully resolved." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had never quite been extinguished. Marcus felt his world tilting, the carefully constructed stability of his civilian life suddenly feeling as fragile as tissue paper. Because he knew exactly which mission Chen was referring to, knew exactly what questions had been raised, and knew exactly why those questions had never been resolved. It was the mission that had ended his career, ended his marriage, ended his belief in the system he'd spent 8 years serving. "Those questions," Marcus said slowly, "were based on incomplete information and false accusations. I was cleared of any wrongdoing." "Were you?" Chen asked, and the question wasn't accusatory but genuinely curious. "Because according to this, you were discharged before the investigation was completed. There was never an official resolution." Before Marcus could respond, Rodriguez stepped forward again, clearly uncomfortable with how long the conversation was taking. "Sergeant Chen, we need to clear this checkpoint. Either he has authorization to be here or he doesn't, and according to his record, he doesn't." Chen looked like she wanted to argue, but protocol was protocol. She turned back to Marcus with genuine regret in her eyes. "Captain, I'm sorry, but without proper authorization, I can't allow you on base. If you want to appeal this decision, you'll need to go through official channels." Marcus felt something breaking inside him, not with a crash but with a slow, inexorable crack like ice giving way under pressure. Official channels. Appeal processes. Bureaucratic procedures. The same maze of red tape and institutional indifference that had trapped him for 6 years. He looked past the security checkpoint toward the base beyond, where he could see families gathering for a ceremony that was supposed to honor service like his, where veterans were being welcomed and celebrated, while he stood on the wrong side of a barrier arm, like some kind of security threat. "I just want to pay my respects," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. "I just want to remember what it felt like to serve something bigger than myself." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of the military band and the morning breeze rustling through the Kansas wheat fields. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. Chen stared at her clipboard, and Marcus stood there with his service dog and his polished boots and his invitation to a ceremony he would never attend. But then, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk, came a voice that changed everything. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you will step away from that gate right now and bring Captain Thompson to my office immediately." Everyone turned to see Colonel Sarah Mitchell striding across the parking lot with the kind of purposeful gait that left no doubt about her authority. She was tall, probably in her late 40s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her uniform was immaculate, her bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Rodriguez snapped to attention so quickly, Marcus thought he might give himself whiplash. "Ma'am, this individual doesn't have proper authorization for base access. His records show—" "I don't care what his records show, Sergeant," Mitchell interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made arguments unnecessary. "I know exactly who Captain Thompson is, and I know exactly why he's here. And if you think for 1 second that I'm going to allow a decorated veteran to be turned away from a ceremony honoring his service because of bureaucratic nonsense, then you haven't been paying attention during your training." She turned to Marcus, and for the first time in 6 years, he saw something in an officer's eyes that he'd almost forgotten existed. Recognition. Not just of his rank or his record, but of him as a person, as someone who mattered. "Captain Thompson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Base Deputy Commander. I apologize for this inexcusable treatment. You are absolutely welcome here, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." Marcus shook her hand, feeling like he might fall over from the relief flooding through his system. "Thank you, ma'am. I wasn't sure anyone would remember." "Oh, I remember," Mitchell said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she remembered more than just his name. "In fact, I think it's past time we had a conversation about what really happened during Operation Enduring Shield. Because the story you were told about your discharge, that's not the whole truth." The barrier arm rose with a mechanical whir that sounded like hope taking flight, and for the first time in 6 years, Captain Marcus Thompson drove onto a military base as a welcomed guest rather than an unwanted reminder of questions no one wanted to answer. The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under Marcus's apartment door sometime between his 3 a.m. nightmare and his 6 a.m. attempt at coffee. He almost stepped on it as he shuffled toward the kitchenette, Ranger padding silently behind him like a 4-legged shadow. The envelope was unmarked, except for his name written in precise block letters, the kind of handwriting that spoke of military training and careful attention to detail. Inside, Marcus found a single sheet of paper with an official letterhead he recognized but hadn't seen in years. The message was brief, almost cryptic in its simplicity. "The truth about Phoenix Base deserves to be heard. The ceremony at Whitman is your chance. Don't let them silence you again. A friend who remembers." There was no signature, no return address, no clue about who might have sent it or why they'd chosen this particular moment to reach out. Marcus read the note 3 times, each reading bringing a fresh wave of unease that started in his stomach and spread outward like ripples in still water. Phoenix Base. The name alone was enough to transport him back to those final days in Afghanistan, to the mission that had ended his career and changed the trajectory of his life. For 6 years he'd tried to forget the heat, the dust, the sound of rotor blades cutting through morning air, the weight of decisions that had seemed so clear in the moment but had become increasingly murky in the years that followed. He'd been a captain then, 28 years old and commanding a combat aviation brigade unit responsible for medical evacuations and close air support in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. His crew had been tight-knit, professional, the kind of soldiers who could anticipate each other's moves and communicate with glances rather than words. They'd flown dozens of missions together, saved countless lives, earned commendations and the respect of their peers. Marcus had been proud of his service, proud of his team, proud of the difference they were making in a war that often seemed impossible to win. The mission that changed everything had started like any other. Intelligence reports indicated that a remote forward operating base was under siege, with wounded soldiers requiring immediate evacuation. The coordinates had been verified, the flight path cleared, the medical team briefed and ready. Marcus had piloted the lead helicopter, his crew chief Staff Sergeant Mike O'Connor, coordinating with the ground team, while their medic prepared for what they expected to be a routine extraction under fire. But nothing about that mission had been routine. The coordinates had led them to a compound that intelligence claimed was occupied by friendly forces, but looked suspiciously like the Taliban strongholds they'd been targeting for months. The radio chatter had been confusing, voices speaking in languages and codes that didn't match their briefings. When they'd attempted to land, gunfire had erupted from multiple positions, and Marcus had been forced to make a split-second decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He'd ordered his gunner to return fire, to suppress the positions that were threatening his aircraft and crew. The engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes, but in those minutes, everything had gone wrong. The building they'd targeted had contained not enemy combatants but a group of Afghan civilians, including children, who had been seeking shelter from the ongoing fighting. The intelligence had been wrong, the coordinates had been wrong, and Marcus's decision to engage had resulted in casualties that would forever stain his conscience. The investigation that followed had been swift and thorough, at least on the surface. Marcus had been questioned repeatedly, his actions scrutinized by officers who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the heat of enemy fire, or faced the impossible choice between protecting his crew and protecting potential civilians. The official report had concluded that Marcus had acted within rules of engagement based on the information available at the time, but there had been whispers, suggestions that he'd been too quick to shoot, too eager to engage, too willing to risk civilian lives. Those whispers had followed him through the remainder of his deployment and back to the United States, where the investigation had continued in conference rooms and offices far from the battlefield. Marcus had expected vindication, expected the system to recognize that he'd made the best decision possible under impossible circumstances. Instead, he'd found himself caught in a bureaucratic maze of conflicting reports, missing evidence, and officials who seemed more interested in finding a scapegoat than in understanding what had actually happened. The discharge had come suddenly, presented as a mutual agreement that would allow Marcus to transition to civilian life, with his benefits intact and his record officially clean. But the reality had been more complicated. The circumstances of his separation had been coded in ways that made future employment difficult, had marked him as someone with administrative complications that raised questions without providing answers. He'd been encouraged to accept the discharge quietly, to move on with his life, to put the incident behind him and focus on his future. But the future had proven elusive. Marcus's marriage had crumbled under the weight of his nightmares and his growing isolation. His attempts to find meaningful work had been hampered by background checks that raised red flags without explaining why. He'd moved to Prairie View partly because it was cheap, and partly because it was the kind of place where people didn't ask too many questions about your past. He'd found work at Henderson's hardware store, learned to live with the nightmares, started seeing Dr. Foster when the isolation became too much to bear. For 6 years, he'd built a carefully constructed life of routine and solitude, punctuated by therapy sessions and the occasional conversation with other veterans at the American Legion. He'd told himself he was healing, that the past was behind him, that he'd found a kind of peace in his quiet existence. But the truth was more complicated. The peace was brittle, built on avoidance rather than resolution, and it had taken all his strength to maintain the illusion that he was moving forward rather than simply running in place. The anonymous note had cracked that illusion wide open. Someone out there remembered Phoenix Base, remembered the mission that had ended his career, remembered the questions that had never been answered. Someone thought the truth deserved to be heard, thought Marcus deserved a chance to tell his side of the story. The ceremony at Whitman wasn't just an invitation to honor his service. It was an opportunity to confront the past he'd been trying to escape. Marcus spent the morning pacing his small apartment, the note clutched in his hand, while Ranger watched him with the patient attention of a dog who'd learned to recognize his owner's distress signals. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls closer together, the air thicker and harder to breathe. He'd worked so hard to create a safe space, a place where the past couldn't reach him, but the note had brought Afghanistan into his living room as surely as if he'd opened a door to the desert. By afternoon, he'd made his decision. He would go to the ceremony, not because he was ready to face the past, but because he was tired of running from it. He would accept the invitation, present himself at the gates of Whitman Air Force Base, and see what truths were waiting to be uncovered. The note had promised that the ceremony was his chance. He would take that chance and see where it led. The drive to Whitman took him through the same Kansas countryside he'd traveled that morning. But everything looked different now. The wheat fields that had seemed peaceful in the early light now looked vast and empty, stretching endlessly toward a horizon that promised nothing but more questions. The sky was the same blue he remembered from Afghanistan, the kind of blue that seemed to mock human suffering with its indifferent beauty. As he drove, Marcus found himself thinking about the friend who had sent the note, who remembered Phoenix Base well enough to know that the truth had been buried, who cared enough about his story to reach out after 6 years of silence. The handwriting had been careful, professional, the kind of script that suggested military training, but that could describe dozens of people he'd served with over the years. The phrase, "Don't let them silence you again," suggested someone who knew about the pressure he'd faced to accept his discharge quietly, someone who understood the bureaucratic machinery that had processed him out of the service. The more he thought about it, the more Marcus realized how little he actually knew about his own case. The investigation had been conducted largely without his input, the final report had been classified above his clearance level, and the discharge proceedings had been handled by lawyers who'd spoken in euphemisms and carefully worded statements. He'd been told that accepting the administrative separation was in his best interest, that fighting it would only prolong the process and potentially result in a less favorable outcome. He'd been young enough and traumatized enough to believe them, to trust that the system would ultimately be fair. But 6 years of civilian life had taught him that fairness was often less important than convenience, that institutions were more interested in protecting themselves than in protecting the people who served them. The note suggested that there were things about his case that he'd never been told, truths that had been hidden behind classifications and bureaucratic procedures. The ceremony at Whitman might be his first real opportunity to learn what had actually happened during those final months of his military career. The thought both terrified and energized him. For 6 years he'd lived with uncertainty, with the nagging feeling that he'd been betrayed by the system he'd devoted his life to serving. If there were answers to be found, if there were people who remembered the truth about Phoenix Base, then perhaps it was time to stop running and start fighting. Perhaps it was time to reclaim the narrative of his own life. As he approached the outskirts of Whitman, Marcus felt his heart rate increase, his palms grow damp against the steering wheel. The familiar signs of anxiety were building, but underneath them was something else, something he hadn't felt in years. It was hope, fragile and uncertain, but unmistakably present. Hope that the truth might finally be told, that the questions might finally be answered, that the friend who remembered might help him understand what had really happened during those final days of his military career. The base gates came into view, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. This was it, the moment of truth, the chance to confront the past he'd been avoiding for 6 years. Whatever happened next, whatever truths or lies were waiting behind those gates, he would face them with the same courage that had once made him a leader of men. He would not let them silence him again. Part 3. The reluctant step forward. The decision to attend the ceremony had been made, but actually following through proved to be a different matter entirely. Marcus spent the next 3 days in a state of nervous anticipation that reminded him uncomfortably of the hours before difficult missions in Afghanistan. He would wake up determined to go, spend the morning convincing himself it was the right thing to do, and then spend the afternoon finding reasons to stay home. The note remained on his kitchen table, a constant reminder of the choice he'd made and the courage he'd need to see it through. Dr. Amanda Foster had been encouraging when he'd told her about the invitation and the mysterious note during their Thursday session. Her office in the VA building was a study in institutional beige, with motivational posters and certificates that spoke of good intentions and limited resources. She'd listened to Marcus describe his internal struggle with the kind of professional patience that suggested she'd heard similar stories from other veterans wrestling with their own demons. "What scares you most about going?" she'd asked, leaning forward in her chair with the intensity of someone who genuinely cared about the answer. Marcus had considered the question carefully, trying to untangle the complex web of emotions that the invitation had stirred up. "I'm afraid of what I might learn," he'd finally admitted. "For 6 years, I've been living with uncertainty, but uncertainty can be easier than truth. What if I find out that everything I believed about my service was wrong? What if the people I trusted really did betray me? What if the mission at Phoenix Base was even worse than I remember?" Dr. Foster had nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Those are valid fears, Marcus. But consider this. You've been carrying the weight of unanswered questions for 6 years. That weight has affected your sleep, your relationships, your ability to move forward with your life. Maybe it's time to trade uncertainty for truth, even if the truth is difficult to hear." Her words had stayed with him as he'd driven home through the Kansas countryside, past farms and small towns that represented the America he'd fought to protect. The weight she'd mentioned was real, a constant presence that had shaped every aspect of his civilian life. He'd built his routines around avoiding triggers, structured his days to minimize contact with anything that might remind him of his military service. It was a sustainable existence, but it wasn't really living. The American Legion Post 247 had been busier than usual on Friday night, filled with veterans preparing for the weekend ceremony at Whitman. Marcus had stopped by reluctantly, drawn by a combination of curiosity and loneliness that he didn't quite understand. The post was a classic small-town veteran hangout, with wood-paneled walls covered in military memorabilia and a bar that had seen better decades. The beer was cheap, the conversation predictable, and the camaraderie genuine if sometimes forced. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Connor had been there, nursing a beer and talking quietly with a group of Gulf War veterans about the ceremony. O'Connor was one of the few people in Prairie View who knew about Marcus's military service, though they'd never discussed the circumstances of his discharge. He'd been Marcus's crew chief during their deployment, a steady presence who'd kept their helicopter running and their crew focused during the most dangerous missions. "Thompson," O'Connor had called out when he'd spotted Marcus at the bar. "Heard you might be coming to the ceremony tomorrow. About time you showed your face at one of these things." Marcus had nodded, unsure how to respond. The truth was that he'd been avoiding veteran gatherings for years, uncomfortable with the questions they raised and the memories they triggered. But something about O'Connor's straightforward manner had always made him feel less alone, less like he was carrying his burdens in isolation. "Been thinking about it," Marcus had replied, accepting the beer that O'Connor had bought him. "Not sure I'm ready for all the pageantry and speeches." O'Connor had studied him with the kind of direct gaze that suggested he knew there was more to the story. "You know, I've been wondering for years why you never talk about Afghanistan. We flew a lot of missions together, saved a lot of lives. You were a good officer, Thompson. Whatever happened at the end, that doesn't change the good we did." The comment had hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. O'Connor didn't know about Phoenix Base, didn't know about the investigation or the discharge or the 6 years of questions that had followed. To him, Marcus was simply a fellow veteran who'd served honorably and then disappeared into civilian life. The simplicity of that perspective was both comforting and heartbreaking. "Maybe you're right," Marcus had said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Maybe it's time to stop hiding from the past." The conversation had been interrupted by the arrival of several other veterans, men and women who'd served in various conflicts and were looking forward to the ceremony as a chance to reconnect with their military identity. Marcus had listened to their stories, their casual references to deployments and units and missions, and had felt the familiar ache of belonging to something he'd lost. These people understood sacrifice in ways that civilians never could, understood the weight of responsibility and the cost of service. They were his people, even if he'd spent years pretending otherwise. Saturday morning had arrived with a kind of crisp autumn weather that made Kansas beautiful, all golden light and clear skies that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Marcus had dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were respectful but not too formal, civilian attire that wouldn't draw attention but would show proper respect for the occasion. He'd pinned his service ribbons to his jacket, a small gesture that felt both defiant and terrifying. The drive to Whitman had been quiet, punctuated only by the hum of his truck's engine and Ranger's occasional shifting in the passenger seat. The dog seemed to sense his anxiety, offering the kind of wordless support that had become essential to Marcus's daily functioning. Ranger had been with him for 3 years now, trained to recognize the signs of panic attacks and nightmares, to provide pressure therapy when the memories became too overwhelming. The dog's presence was a reminder of how far he'd come since the darkest days after his discharge, but also of how far he still had to go. As they'd approached the base, Marcus had felt his heart rate increase, his palms grow damp against the steering wheel. The familiar signs of anxiety were building, but underneath them was something else, something he hadn't felt in years. It was anticipation, nervous but genuine, the feeling of someone who was finally ready to confront the questions that had been haunting him for 6 years. The base itself looked different than he remembered from his active duty days. There were more security checkpoints, more barriers, more signs warning about restricted access and heightened alert levels. The world had changed in the years since his discharge, shaped by new threats and new policies that reflected a military increasingly focused on homeland security rather than overseas operations. But the essential character of the place remained unchanged. The neat rows of buildings, the perfectly maintained grounds, the sense of order and purpose that had once defined his daily existence. The parking lot was already busy, with families and veterans arriving for the ceremony. Marcus had watched them through his windshield, noting the easy camaraderie between people who shared a common experience of service. Children ran between the cars carrying small American flags, their laughter mixing with the distant sound of a military band warming up for the day's events. It was a scene of celebration and remembrance, exactly the kind of event that should have filled him with pride and belonging. Instead, he felt like an outsider looking in, separated from the festivities by the weight of his unanswered questions and the fear of what he might learn. The anonymous note had promised that the ceremony was his chance to hear the truth about Phoenix Base, but it hadn't explained how that truth would be revealed or what price he might have to pay for seeking it. The uncertainty was almost paralyzing, a reminder of how much easier it had been to live with questions than to risk discovering uncomfortable answers. But as he'd sat in his truck, watching other veterans gather for a ceremony that honored their service, Marcus had felt something shift inside him. The note had been right about one thing. He'd been silenced for too long, had allowed himself to be processed out of the system without fighting for his own version of events. Maybe it was time to stop being a victim of circumstances and start being an advocate for his own truth. The walk from the parking lot to the main gate had felt like a journey through time, each step carrying him closer to a confrontation with the past he'd been avoiding. Ranger had stayed close to his side, sensing his distress and offering the kind of steady presence that had become essential to Marcus's ability to function in stressful situations. The dog's training had taught him to recognize the signs of panic attacks and nightmares, to provide the kind of grounding touch that could bring Marcus back from the edge of overwhelming anxiety. As they'd approached the security checkpoint, Marcus had felt his breathing become shallow, his vision narrow in the way that suggested an approaching panic attack. But he'd forced himself to keep walking, to put one foot in front of the other, until he was standing in front of the young airman who would decide whether he was welcome at a ceremony honoring his own service. The confrontation that followed had been exactly what he'd feared, and nothing like what he'd expected. The questions about his discharge status, the suggestions that his service had been somehow compromised, the casual dismissal of his right to be there, all of it had brought back the feelings of betrayal and abandonment that had defined his early years of civilian life. But it had also awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long, the fighter's instinct that had once made him a leader of men, the unwillingness to accept defeat without a struggle. Standing at that checkpoint, facing the possibility of being turned away from a ceremony honoring his own service, Marcus had finally understood what the anonymous note had been trying to tell him. The truth about Phoenix Base wasn't just about what had happened during that final mission. It was about what had happened afterward, about the system that had processed him out of the military and the people who had made decisions about his future without his input. The ceremony wasn't just his chance to hear the truth. It was his chance to demand it. Part 4. The Accidental Exposure. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitman Air Force Base parking lot as Marcus Thompson walked toward the main gate, his service dog Ranger maintaining perfect heel position beside him. The air carried the familiar sounds of military life, the distant hum of aircraft engines, the crisp commands of drill instructors, the measured cadence of marching feet, sounds that had once been the soundtrack to his daily existence, but now felt like echoes from someone else's life. Marcus had spent the drive from Prairie View preparing himself for this moment, running through potential conversations in his head and trying to anticipate what questions might be asked. He'd dressed carefully in pressed khakis and a navy blazer, with his service ribbons pinned discreetly to his lapel. The ribbons represented years of honorable service, multiple deployments and commendations that had once filled him with pride. Now they felt like artifacts from a person he used to be, before Phoenix Base, before the investigation, before the discharge that had ended his career and changed his life forever. The invitation to the Meritorious Service Recognition Day ceremony was folded neatly in his jacket pocket, alongside his driver's license and veteran identification card. The invitation had been printed on heavy cardstock with elegant lettering that spoke of official sanction and institutional respect. All veterans and their families are cordially invited to attend, it read, followed by details about the ceremony and a reminder that base access would be provided for all attendees. The language was welcoming, inclusive, the kind of invitation that suggested Marcus's presence would be valued and appreciated. But as he approached the security checkpoint, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that signaled approaching anxiety. The checkpoint was more elaborate than he remembered from his active duty days, with multiple barriers and screening stations that reflected the increased security posture of the post-9/11 military. Young airmen in crisp uniforms checked identification cards and consulted computer screens that presumably contained information about each visitor's background and authorization level. The line moved slowly, families and veterans chatting quietly as they waited their turn to be processed. Marcus found himself studying the other attendees, noting the easy camaraderie between people who shared the common experience of military service. There were older veterans wearing American Legion caps and younger ones with Iraq and Afghanistan service ribbons, spouses and children who had supported their loved ones through deployments and homecomings. It was exactly the kind of gathering that should have made him feel at home, but instead he felt like an imposter, someone who didn't quite belong. When his turn came, Marcus approached the checkpoint with what he hoped was appropriate confidence. The young airman behind the desk looked to be in his early 20s, with the kind of rigid posture and serious expression that suggested recent basic training and a determination to follow procedures exactly as taught. His name tag read Rodriguez, and he examined Marcus's identification with the intensity of someone checking for state secrets. "Captain Thompson," Rodriguez said, and the way he pronounced the rank made it sound like a question rather than a statement. "I see you have an invitation to today's ceremony. I'll need to verify your authorization to be on this base." Marcus felt the first flutter of unease in his stomach. "Authorization? The invitation says that all veterans are welcome. I served for 8 years, multiple deployments. I should be on any list of authorized personnel." Rodriguez's expression didn't change as he turned to his computer screen and began typing. Marcus could see him scrolling through what appeared to be a database, his frown deepening with each passing second. Other families were being waved through with minimal scrutiny, their invitations apparently sufficient to guarantee access. But Rodriguez seemed to be finding something in Marcus's record that required additional attention. "Sir, I'm seeing some complications with your status," Rodriguez said carefully. "It appears your discharge was administrative rather than standard retirement. There are some flags in the system that require additional verification before I can grant base access. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, each syllable carrying the weight of 6 years of bureaucratic nightmares and unanswered questions. Administrative discharge, flags in the system, complications. The euphemisms that had followed him since leaving the military, the coded language that marked him as someone whose service had been somehow compromised, somehow questionable. "What kind of flags?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was honorably discharged. My service record is clean." Rodriguez consulted his screen again, his expression growing more serious. "I'm not authorized to discuss the specifics, sir, but I need to make some phone calls before I can allow you on base. If you could please step aside and wait, I'll try to get this resolved as quickly as possible." Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger. Around him, other families continued to be processed efficiently, their invitations accepted without question or delay. He was being singled out, marked as someone whose presence required special scrutiny, someone whose service was somehow suspect. The feeling was familiar and devastating, a reminder of all the ways his life had been complicated by questions he'd never been allowed to answer. He stepped aside as requested, Ranger immediately sensing his distress and moving closer to provide the comfort of warm fur against his leg. The dog's training had taught him to recognize the signs of panic attacks and anxiety, to provide the kind of grounding presence that could prevent Marcus from becoming overwhelmed by stress. But this situation was different from the usual triggers that sent him into a spiral of anxiety. This was public humiliation, a rejection of his right to be treated with the respect that his service should have earned. 20 minutes passed before Rodriguez emerged from his booth, his expression more serious than before. During that time, Marcus had watched dozens of other veterans pass through the checkpoint without incident, their invitations accepted, and their presence welcomed. He'd seen families with children, elderly World War II veterans in wheelchairs, young soldiers from recent conflicts, all of them processed efficiently and courteously. Only he had been marked as someone requiring special attention, someone whose service was somehow questionable. "Captain Thompson," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a note of finality that Marcus immediately recognized. "I've spoken with several offices, and I'm afraid there's a problem with your authorization. Your discharge status shows administrative separation under circumstances that require additional review before base access can be granted." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The careful stability he'd built over 6 years of civilian life suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper. "What circumstances? I was cleared of any wrongdoing." The investigation found no evidence of misconduct. Rodriguez consulted his notes, his expression uncomfortable but determined. "Sir, the details are classified above my level, but I can tell you that your file shows unresolved questions about your final deployment. There are recommendations that base access be restricted pending further review by appropriate authorities." The words came out in a rush, as if Rodriguez was trying to get through an unpleasant duty as quickly as possible. Marcus felt his vision narrow, his breathing become shallow, the familiar signs of panic beginning to build. Unresolved questions, restricted access, appropriate authorities. The same bureaucratic language that had been used to process him out of the military, the same careful euphemisms that had marked him as someone whose service was somehow compromised. "I have an invitation," Marcus said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I was told that all veterans are welcome. I served my country for 8 years, flew combat missions, saved lives. I have every right to be here." Rodriguez's expression softened slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. "I understand your frustration, sir, but I have to follow protocol. If you want to appeal this decision, you'll need to go through official channels. For now, I'm not authorized to allow you on base." The rejection was like a door slamming shut, cutting off Marcus's access to the world he'd once inhabited, the community he'd once belonged to. He stood there in the Kansas morning sunlight, watching other veterans stream past him toward a ceremony that was supposed to honor service like his, feeling more alone than he had since the darkest days after his discharge. But, As he stood there, fighting back the panic that threatened to overwhelm him, Marcus became aware of someone watching him. Master Sergeant Lisa Chen had been observing the confrontation from her position at the adjacent checkpoint, her expression thoughtful and increasingly concerned. She was older than Rodriguez, probably in her 40s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of experience rather than just training. Chen approached slowly, her manner respectful but determined. "Captain Thompson, I'm Master Sergeant Chen. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Airman Rodriguez. I understand there's been some confusion about your base access." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone who addressed him with the respect due his rank, someone who seemed to understand that there might be more to this story than administrative complications. "There's no confusion on my end, Sergeant. I received an invitation to attend today's ceremony. I am a veteran, and, as far as I know, I have every right to be here." Chen nodded thoughtfully, studying the paperwork that Rodriguez had accumulated. "I can see the invitation, sir, and I'm looking at your service record. 8 years of active duty, multiple deployments, commendations for valor and meritorious service. Very impressive record." She paused, and Marcus could see her wrestling with something. "But I'm also seeing annotations in the system that I don't fully understand. Annotations that were added after your discharge, apparently by someone with significant authority." "What kind of annotations?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Chen's expression grew more serious. "The kind that suggest there were questions about your final mission, questions that apparently were never fully resolved. According to this, your discharge was expedited to avoid what the system describes as potential complications arising from ongoing operational security concerns." The euphemisms were getting more elaborate, but the meaning was clear. Someone had wanted him out of the military quickly, before questions could be asked or answers could be demanded. The expedited discharge had been presented as a kindness, a way to avoid prolonged investigation and potential disciplinary action. But the reality was more complex, more troubling. "Those operational security concerns," Marcus said carefully, "were they ever investigated? Were they ever resolved?" Chen shook her head. "Not according to this. The file shows that the investigation was suspended when you accepted discharge. The questions were never answered because there was no one left to answer them." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. For 6 years, he'd been living with the assumption that his case had been closed, that the investigation had reached some kind of conclusion, even if he'd never been told what that conclusion was. But now it appeared that the investigation had simply been abandoned, the questions left hanging in bureaucratic limbo, because it was easier to process him out of the system than to seek the truth. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. "Do I just turn around and leave? Do I accept that my service doesn't matter? That the sacrifices I made don't count for anything?" Chen looked genuinely pained by the question. "Captain, I wish I could give you a different answer, but without proper authorization, I can't allow you on base. The security protocols are clear, and I don't have the authority to override them." Marcus felt something breaking inside him, not with a crash, but with a slow, inexorable crack like ice giving way under pressure. The invitation in his pocket felt like a mockery, a promise that had been made and then broken by bureaucratic complications that no one seemed willing or able to explain. He looked past the checkpoint toward the base beyond, where he could see families gathering for a ceremony that was supposed to honor service like his, where veterans were being welcomed and celebrated while he stood on the wrong side of a barrier like some kind of security threat. "I just want to pay my respects," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. "I just want to remember what it felt like to serve something bigger than myself." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of the military band warming up for the ceremony and the morning breeze rustling through the Kansas wheat fields. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. Chen stared at her paperwork, and Marcus stood there with his service dog and his pressed khakis, and his invitation to a ceremony he would never attend. But then, as if summoned by his desperation, a voice cut through the morning air with a kind of authority that made arguments unnecessary. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you will step away from that gate right now and bring Captain Thompson to my office immediately." Everyone turned to see Colonel Sarah Mitchell striding across the parking lot with the purposeful gait of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. She was tall, probably in her late 40s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her uniform was immaculate, her bearing unmistakably that of someone who had earned her rank through competence and leadership rather than just time in service. Rodriguez snapped to attention so quickly that Marcus thought he might give himself whiplash. "Ma'am, this individual doesn't have proper authorization for base access. His records show administrative complications that require—" "I don't care what his records show, Sergeant," Mitchell interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made further argument pointless. "I know exactly who Captain Thompson is, and I know exactly why he's here. And if you think for one moment that I'm going to allow a decorated veteran to be turned away from a ceremony honoring his service because of bureaucratic nonsense, then you haven't been paying attention to what this uniform represents." She turned to Marcus, and for the first time in 6 years, he saw something in an officer's eyes that he'd almost forgotten existed: recognition, not just of his rank or his record, but of him as a person, as someone who mattered, as someone whose service had value beyond the complications noted in his file. "Captain Thompson," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Deputy Base Commander. I apologize for this inexcusable treatment. You are absolutely welcome here, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." Marcus shook her hand, feeling like he might collapse from the relief flooding through his system. "Thank you, ma'am. I wasn't sure anyone would remember." "Oh, I remember," Mitchell said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she remembered more than just his name and rank. "In fact, I think it's past time we had a conversation about what really happened during your final deployment. Because the story you were told about your discharge, the reasons you were given for leaving the service, that's not the whole truth. Not even close." The barrier arm rose with a mechanical whir that sounded like hope taking flight, and for the first time in 6 years, Captain Marcus Thompson drove onto a military base not as a supplicant seeking permission, but as a veteran whose service was finally being recognized for what it truly was. Part 5, The First Stand. The walk from the main gate to Colonel Mitchell's office felt like a journey through a landscape of memory and possibility. Marcus had driven these same roads during his years of active duty, had passed these same buildings and formations, had been part of the daily rhythm of military life that now seemed as distant as childhood. But with each step, accompanied by Colonel Mitchell's confident stride and Ranger's steady presence at his side, he felt something inside him beginning to shift. The weight of 6 years of doubt and self-questioning was still there, but it was being balanced by something else, the possibility that his version of events might finally be heard. Colonel Mitchell's office was located in the base headquarters building, a structure that had been built during the height of the Cold War and maintained with a kind of institutional pride that kept military installations looking sharp regardless of their age. The walk from the main gate to Colonel Mitchell's office felt like a journey through a landscape of memory and possibility. Marcus had driven these same roads during his years of active duty, had passed these same buildings and formations, had been part of the daily rhythm of military life that now seemed as distant as childhood. But with each step, accompanied by Colonel Mitchell's confident stride and Ranger's steady presence at his side, he felt something inside him beginning to shift. The weight of 6 years of doubt and self-questioning was still there, but it was being balanced by something else, the possibility that his version of events might finally be heard. Colonel Mitchell's office was located in the base headquarters building, a structure that had been built during the height of the Cold War and maintained with the kind of institutional pride that kept military installations looking sharp, regardless of their age. The hallways were lined with photographs of previous commanders, displays of unit history, and the kind of military memorabilia that spoke of traditions carefully preserved and handed down through generations of service members. For Marcus, walking through these corridors felt like returning to a world he'd been exiled from, a world where his identity had once been clear and his purpose undeniable. The office itself was spacious and professional, with windows that looked out over the flight line, where aircraft sat in neat rows like sleeping giants. Mitchell's desk was organized, but not obsessively so, with the kind of controlled chaos that suggested someone who had too much work and too little time but refused to let either compromise her effectiveness. The walls were decorated with commendations, unit photographs, and a large map of Afghanistan that was marked with colored pins indicating various operations and forward bases. "Please, have a seat," Mitchell said, gesturing to a pair of leather chairs arranged in front of her desk. "I imagine you have a lot of questions about what just happened at the gate." Marcus settled into the chair, Ranger immediately positioning himself at his feet in the way that provided maximum comfort and security. The dog's training had taught him to recognize environments where his human might need additional support, and the formal military setting clearly qualified. "I have to admit, Colonel, I'm not sure what to think. For 6 years, I've been told that my discharge was clean, that the investigation was concluded, that I should move on with my life. But what happened at the gate suggests there's more to the story." Mitchell leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "There's a lot more to the story, Captain. But before we get into that, I want you to understand something. What happened to you wasn't an accident. It wasn't a bureaucratic mistake, or a case of paperwork getting lost in the system. It was deliberate, and it was wrong." The words hit Marcus with unexpected force. For 6 years, he'd been trying to make sense of his discharge, trying to understand why the system had seemed to turn against him so suddenly. He'd wondered if he'd misunderstood something, if there had been some failure on his part that had justified the way he'd been treated. But Mitchell's words suggested that the fault hadn't been his, that the system had failed him rather than the other way around. "I'm not sure I understand," Marcus said carefully. "The investigation concluded that I had acted within the rules of engagement based on the information available at the time. The discharge was presented as a mutual agreement, a way to avoid prolonged proceedings that might have been more difficult for everyone involved." Mitchell's expression hardened. "That's the official story, yes. But the official story was crafted by people who had their own reasons for wanting the truth to stay buried. The real story is more complicated, and it starts with understanding who you were dealing with during that final deployment." She turned to the map on the wall, pointing to a location in eastern Afghanistan marked with a red pin. "Phoenix Base. Your final mission. Tell me what you remember about the intelligence that led to that engagement." Marcus felt his throat tighten as the memories came flooding back. "We received word that a forward operating base was under attack, that there were wounded soldiers requiring immediate evacuation. The coordinates were verified through multiple channels, the flight path was cleared, and we were briefed on the expected threat level. Everything seemed routine until we arrived at the target location." "And what did you find when you arrived?" "A compound that didn't match the intelligence we'd received. The buildings were civilian in nature, there were no signs of military occupation, and the radio chatter didn't match our briefings. But we were taking fire from multiple positions, and I had to make a decision about whether to engage or withdraw." Mitchell nodded grimly. "You made the decision to engage, to protect your crew, and complete the mission as you understood it. And that decision resulted in civilian casualties that haunted you for years afterward." 11 civilians, Marcus said. The number burned into his memory. "Including 4 children. The intelligence was wrong, the coordinates were wrong, and my decision to engage resulted in the deaths of innocent people." "That's what you were told," Mitchell said. "But here's what you weren't told. The intelligence wasn't wrong by accident. It was wrong by design." Marcus felt the world tilt around him, the carefully constructed understanding of his final mission beginning to crumble. "What do you mean, by design?" Mitchell walked to her desk and retrieved a thick folder that had been sitting in a secure drawer. "I've been waiting 6 years for this conversation, Captain. waiting for the right moment to tell you what really happened during Operation Enduring Shield. The truth about Phoenix Base, about the intelligence that led to your engagement, and about the people who made sure that truth stayed buried. She opened the folder and spread several documents across her desk. Marcus could see satellite photos, intelligence reports, and communication logs that he'd never seen before. Your mission was compromised from the beginning. The intelligence about the forward operating base under attack was fabricated. The coordinates were deliberately altered to send you to a civilian compound. And the radio chatter that confused you was part of an elaborate deception designed to create exactly the kind of tragic mistake that occurred. Marcus felt his hands begin to shake. But why? Why would someone want to create a situation like that? Because there were people in the intelligence community who needed a scapegoat for a larger operation that had gone wrong. Phoenix Base was supposed to be a success story, a demonstration of how advanced intelligence gathering could prevent civilian casualties in complex combat environments. Instead, it became a disaster that threatened to expose serious flaws in the system. Mitchell pointed to one of the satellite photos, which showed the compound Marcus had engaged. This wasn't a random target. It was a carefully chosen location that would maximize the political impact of any mistake. The people in this compound were known to international observers. Their deaths would generate significant media attention, and the resulting investigation would provide cover for much larger problems in the intelligence apparatus. "You're saying I was set up," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying you were used. Your reputation as a skilled and decisive officer made you the perfect choice for a mission that required someone who would act quickly under pressure. The intelligence was crafted to create a situation where you would have to make a split-second decision based on incomplete information. When that decision resulted in civilian casualties, you became the face of a tragedy that had been orchestrated by people who never intended to take responsibility for their actions." Marcus felt sick, not just from the implications of what Mitchell was telling him, but from the realization that his 6 years of guilt and self-doubt had been based on a lie. The investigation afterward, the questions about my judgment, the pressure to accept discharge, all part of the cover-up, Mitchell confirmed. The investigation was designed to focus attention on your decision-making process, rather than on the intelligence failures that had made that decision inevitable. The questions about your judgment were meant to discredit you as a witness to what had really happened, and the pressure to accept discharge was meant to remove you from the system before you could ask the kinds of questions that might expose the truth. "But you know the truth," Marcus said. "You've known it for 6 years. Why didn't you come forward? Why didn't you try to stop what was happening to me?" Mitchell's expression grew pained. "Because I was part of the system that failed you. I was working in intelligence coordination at the time, and I saw the reports that were being generated about Phoenix Base. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have the authority or the evidence to challenge the official narrative. When you were processed out of the system, I tried to intervene, but I was told that it was better for everyone if the matter was resolved quietly. So you let them destroy my career, my reputation, my life?" "I let them do it because I was a coward," Mitchell said bluntly. "I was more concerned about my own career than about seeking justice for what had been done to you. It's taken me 6 years to work up the courage to tell you the truth, and even now, I'm not sure I'm doing it for the right reasons." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of revelation and regret. Marcus felt as though he was seeing the last 6 years of his life through a different lens, understanding for the first time that his struggles with civilian life hadn't been the result of his own failures but of a systematic effort to discredit and silence him. The nightmares, the anxiety, the sense of being adrift in a world that no longer made sense. All of it had been the result of a betrayal that went deeper than he'd ever imagined. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "What do I do with this information?" Mitchell leaned forward, her expression intense. "That depends on what you want to happen. I have evidence that proves what I've just told you. Documents that show how the intelligence was manipulated. Communications that reveal the real purpose of your mission. But exposing that evidence would require courage from both of us, and it would have consequences that go far beyond just clearing your name." "What kind of consequences?" The kind that could bring down careers, expose systematic corruption in the intelligence community, and reveal truths that powerful people have spent 6 years trying to keep hidden. There would be investigations, hearings, media attention. Your life would become very public, very complicated, and very dangerous. Marcus thought about the anonymous note that had brought him to the ceremony, the promise that the truth about Phoenix Base deserved to be heard. Someone else knows about this. Someone sent me a note telling me to come here today, telling me not to let them silence me again. Mitchell nodded. There are others who know pieces of the truth. People who were involved in the operation. People who saw what happened to you and felt guilty about their silence. The note you received was probably from someone who's been waiting for the right moment to come forward. And is this the right moment? I think it might be. The political landscape has changed since your discharge. There's more appetite for investigating intelligence failures, more willingness to hold people accountable for their actions. And there are people in positions of authority who weren't there 6 years ago, people who don't have a stake in protecting the old system. Marcus felt a strange sense of calm settling over him, as if the revelation of the truth had finally allowed him to stop fighting against currents he couldn't understand. What would you need from me? I would need you to be willing to tell your story, to testify about what happened during your final deployment and what you experienced during the investigation that followed. I would need you to be prepared for the fact that some people will try to discredit you, to suggest that you're an unreliable witness seeking to avoid responsibility for your actions. And in return, I would provide you with the evidence that proves your innocence, the documents that show how you were manipulated and betrayed. I would use my position and my connections to ensure that your story is heard by the right people. And I would do everything in my power to make sure that the people who destroyed your career are held accountable for their actions. Marcus looked down at Ranger, who was watching him with the kind of patient attention that had become essential to his daily functioning. The dog's presence was a reminder of how far he'd come since the darkest days after his discharge, but also of how much further he still had to go. The truth that Mitchell had revealed was devastating, but it was also liberating. For the first time in 6 years, he understood that his suffering hadn't been the result of his own failures but of a systematic effort to silence him. I'll do it, he said, not because I want revenge, but because other people deserve to know the truth. Because there might be other soldiers out there who've been used the same way I was, and they deserve better than what I got. Mitchell smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely hopeful. Then we have work to do. But first, I think you should attend the ceremony that brought you here today. You've earned the right to be honored alongside your fellow veterans, and it's time for people to see you as the hero you've always been, rather than the scapegoat you were made to be. As they prepared to leave the office, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond just surviving from day to day. The truth about Phoenix Base was finally going to be told, and he was going to be the one to tell it. The long journey from that dusty compound in Afghanistan to this moment in Colonel Mitchell's office was finally reaching its destination, and for the first time in 6 years, Marcus Thompson felt like he was ready to come home. The ceremony that Marcus Thompson had fought so hard to attend unfolded on the main parade ground of Whitman Air Force Base, under a canopy of autumn sky that seemed to stretch endlessly across the Kansas horizon. Families had gathered in neat rows of folding chairs, children clutched small American flags, and the military band filled the crisp morning air with patriotic melodies that stirred something deep in the hearts of everyone present. For Marcus, sitting in the front row beside Colonel Mitchell, the scene represented something he had thought lost forever, a place where his service was valued, where his sacrifice was recognized, and where his story could finally be told without fear or shame. The past 3 hours had transformed everything Marcus thought he knew about his military career and his subsequent exile from the community that had once defined his identity. Colonel Mitchell's revelations about Phoenix Base had rewritten the narrative of his final deployment, revealing a web of deception and manipulation that had used him as an unwitting pawn in a larger game of political and institutional survival. The guilt that had haunted him for 6 years, the nightmares that had robbed him of sleep, the sense of failure that had poisoned his civilian life. All of it had been based on lies crafted by people who had sacrificed his reputation to protect their own. But understanding the truth was only the beginning. As Marcus sat in his chair, with Ranger pressed against his legs, he could feel the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like an old familiar burden. Colonel Mitchell had offered him the evidence to clear his name, the documents to expose the conspiracy that had destroyed his career, and the support to ensure his story would be heard by the right people. But she had also warned him about the consequences of seeking justice, the scrutiny that would follow, the powerful enemies he would make, and the personal cost of fighting a system that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The ceremony began with the traditional presentation of colors, young airmen marching in perfect synchronization while carrying flags that represented the values Marcus had once sworn to defend. As the national anthem played, he found himself standing straighter than he had in years, his hand over his heart, his eyes fixed on the flag that had once meant everything to him. The music stirred memories of his own military service, of early morning formations and evening retreats, of the pride he had felt in wearing the uniform and serving something larger than himself. General Robert Hayes, the base commander, took the podium to address the assembled crowd. He was a man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence in subordinates and civilians alike. His remarks began with the traditional acknowledgments and expressions of gratitude that were standard for such occasions, but as he continued, his words took on a more personal and urgent tone. "Today we gather not just to honor the abstract concept of service," General Hayes said, his voice carrying clearly across the parade ground, "but to recognize the individual men and women who have embodied that service through their actions, their sacrifice, and their unwavering commitment to principles larger than themselves. Some of these heroes are with us today, some have gone before us, and some carry invisible wounds that remind us of the true cost of freedom." Marcus felt Colonel Mitchell's eyes on him, understanding that this moment represented a choice point that would define the rest of his life. He could remain silent, accept the private vindication that Mitchell had offered, and return to his quiet existence in Prairie View with the knowledge that his reputation had been restored in the eyes of at least one person who mattered. Or he could step forward into the light, tell his story to the world, and risk everything on the possibility that truth and justice might finally prevail over institutional convenience and political expedience. As if sensing his internal struggle, Ranger shifted position and placed his head on Marcus's knee, offering the kind of wordless support that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his civilian life. The dog's presence was a reminder of how far he had come since those early days after his discharge, when the weight of guilt and confusion had nearly overwhelmed his ability to function. He had built a life of sorts in the years since leaving the military, found work that provided purpose, if not passion, developed relationships that offered companionship, if not deep connection, and established routines that provided stability, if not excitement. But as he sat listening to General Hayes speak about the importance of honoring service and supporting veterans, Marcus realized that the life he had built was incomplete. It was a life constructed around avoidance rather than engagement, around hiding rather than healing, around accepting injustice rather than fighting for truth. The revelation of Colonel Mitchell's evidence had given him the opportunity to reclaim not just his reputation, but his identity, as someone who stood for something meaningful, someone who was willing to fight for principles even when the cost was high. The ceremony continued with the presentation of awards and recognitions, each recipient walking across the stage to receive acknowledgement for their service and sacrifice. Marcus watched as veterans from different conflicts and different generations stepped forward to be honored, their faces reflecting the complex mixture of pride and humility that came with public recognition of private dedication. These were his people, he realized, men and women who had chosen service over safety, who had risked everything for ideals that couldn't be measured in dollars or advancement or personal gain. When General Hayes announced a special recognition for veterans who had served with distinction in recent conflicts, Marcus felt his heart rate increase. Colonel Mitchell had arranged for his name to be included in this portion of the ceremony, a symbolic restoration of his standing in the military community that had rejected him 6 years earlier. But as his name was called, and he rose to walk toward the stage, Marcus understood that this moment represented far more than symbolic gestures or private vindication. The walk across the parade ground felt like a journey through time and possibility, with each step accompanied by the applause of hundreds of people who had gathered to honor service like his. Marcus felt layers of shame and self-doubt falling away like old skin. The guilt that had defined his civilian life was being replaced by something else: anger at the people who had betrayed him, determination to seek justice for what had been done, and hope that his story might prevent similar betrayals from happening to other veterans in the future. As he reached the stage and shook hands with General Hayes, Marcus felt the weight of Colonel Mitchell's folder in his jacket pocket. The evidence was there, the proof that would expose the conspiracy that had destroyed his career and vindicate his actions during that final deployment. But more importantly, the evidence represented the possibility of transformation, not just for himself, but for the system that had failed him, and countless other veterans who had been sacrificed on the altar of institutional convenience. "Captain Thompson," General Hayes said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "your service to this nation exemplifies the highest traditions of the Air Force. Your courage under fire, your dedication to your fellow service members, and your unwavering commitment to the mission represent the very best of what it means to wear the uniform." The words were standard ceremony language, the kind of formal recognition that was given to every recipient. But coming after 6 years of silence and rejection, they felt like a validation of everything Marcus had believed about his service, but had been forced to question. As he accepted the commendation and turned to face the crowd, he could see the faces of people who understood the cost of service, who appreciated the sacrifice required to defend the freedoms that others took for granted. But Marcus also understood that accepting this recognition in silence would represent a betrayal of everything he had learned about truth and justice. The applause that greeted him was based on an incomplete understanding of his story, a version of events that had been carefully crafted to avoid uncomfortable questions about institutional failures and systemic corruption. If he walked off this stage without speaking, he would be complicit in the same kind of cover-up that had destroyed his career and left other veterans vulnerable to similar betrayals. Instead of leaving the stage, Marcus stepped to the microphone that had been used for the ceremony. The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something unscripted was about to happen. General Hayes looked surprised, but made no move to intervene, perhaps understanding that this moment belonged to Marcus and whatever truth he chose to share. 6 years ago, Marcus began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "I was processed out of the Air Force under circumstances that I was told were necessary to protect national security interests. I was encouraged to accept my discharge quietly, to move on with my life, and to avoid asking questions that might complicate things for everyone involved. I followed that advice because I trusted the system I had served, because I believed that the people making decisions about my future had my best interests at heart." The crowd remained silent, hundreds of people sensing that they were witnessing something significant, something that went beyond the usual ceremonial recognition of service and sacrifice. Marcus could see Colonel Mitchell in the front row, her expression tense but supportive, understanding that this moment represented the point of no return in their shared commitment to exposing the truth. "What I learned today," Marcus continued, "is that my trust was misplaced. The circumstances of my discharge were not necessary to protect national security. They were necessary to protect the careers and reputations of people who had used me as a scapegoat for their own failures. The mission that ended my career was compromised from the beginning, designed to create the kind of tragic mistake that would divert attention from much larger problems in the intelligence community." A murmur ran through the crowd as people began to understand the implications of what Marcus was saying. This was not the usual veteran ceremony, with its predictable speeches about honor and sacrifice. This was something else entirely, a public reckoning with institutional failure, a moment when someone who had been silenced was finally choosing to speak. "I'm not telling you this to seek sympathy or to avoid responsibility for my actions," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm telling you this because other veterans deserve better than what I received." They deserve to serve in a system that values truth over convenience, that protects those who sacrifice rather than those who benefit from their sacrifice, and that takes responsibility for its failures rather than shifting blame to the people who trusted it most. Marcus could see that his words were having an impact, not just on the crowd, but on the military personnel who were present. These were people who understood the importance of institutional integrity, who had built their careers on the assumption that the system they served was fundamentally just and honorable. The possibility that this system had systematically betrayed one of their own was both shocking and deeply troubling. Colonel Sarah Mitchell has provided me with evidence that proves everything I've just told you, Marcus continued, removing the folder from his jacket and holding it up for everyone to see. Documents that show how intelligence was manipulated, communications that reveal the real purpose of my final mission, and proof that my discharge was orchestrated to prevent the truth from being exposed. This evidence will be turned over to the appropriate authorities, and I will cooperate fully with any investigation that follows. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind rustling through the flags that surrounded the parade ground. Marcus understood that he had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, that he had committed himself to a path that would bring scrutiny, opposition, and personal cost. But he also understood that silence was no longer an option, that the truth demanded to be told regardless of the consequences. I want to thank Colonel Mitchell for her courage in coming forward, General Hayes for allowing me to speak today, and all of you for listening to a story that needed to be heard, Marcus concluded. Most importantly, I want to thank the veterans and service members who continue to serve with honor despite the failures of the institutions they represent. Your dedication gives me hope that the system can be reformed, that justice can be achieved, and that future generations of veterans will receive the respect and support they deserve. As Marcus stepped away from the microphone, the crowd erupted in applause that was different from the polite recognition that had greeted the earlier ceremony. This was something more visceral, more emotional, the kind of response that came from people who understood they had witnessed something important, something that would have consequences far beyond the confines of this particular ceremony. In the days and weeks that followed, Marcus's revelations would trigger a series of investigations that would expose corruption throughout the military intelligence community. Congressional hearings would be convened, careers would be destroyed, and reforms would be implemented to prevent similar betrayals from happening in the future. The evidence that Colonel Mitchell had preserved for 6 years would prove decisive in holding people accountable for their actions and ensuring that the truth about Phoenix Base was finally told. But for Marcus, the most important outcome was personal rather than institutional. Standing on that stage, telling his story to a crowd of people who understood the cost of service, he had finally reclaimed his identity as someone who stood for something meaningful. The guilt and shame that had defined his civilian life were replaced by a sense of purpose that gave meaning to everything he had endured. He was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond his control, but an agent of change who had chosen truth over convenience, justice over safety, and integrity over institutional loyalty. The ceremony concluded with the traditional playing of taps, a haunting melody that honored those who had given their lives in service to their country. As the final notes faded across the Kansas prairie, Marcus felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for 6 years. His military career was over, but his service to the ideals that had motivated that career was just beginning. The fight for truth and justice would continue, but now he would wage that fight with the support of people who understood its importance and the evidence to make it successful. Walking off the parade ground with Ranger at his side and Colonel Mitchell beside him, Marcus Thompson finally understood what it meant to come home. Not to a place or an institution, but to a sense of purpose that transcended the circumstances of his personal situation. The anonymous note that had brought him to this ceremony had promised that the truth about Phoenix Base deserved to be heard. That promise had been kept, and the consequences would echo through the military community for years to come. The setting sun painted the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson as Marcus drove away from Whitman Air Force Base for what he knew might be the last time. But unlike his departure 6 years earlier, this leaving was filled with hope rather than despair, purpose rather than confusion, and the satisfaction that comes from choosing truth over comfort. The long journey from that dusty compound in Afghanistan to this moment of vindication was finally complete, and Captain Marcus Thompson was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. 3 months after Marcus Thompson's revelations at the Whitman Air Force Base ceremony, the ripple effects of his courage were still spreading through Washington, D.C. like waves from a stone thrown into still water. The Senate Armed Services Committee had convened special hearings on intelligence oversight. The Inspector General's office had launched a comprehensive investigation into Operation Enduring Shield, and 6 high-ranking officials had either resigned or been relieved of duty pending criminal charges. But for Marcus, sitting in a coffee shop near the Capitol building on a gray February morning, the most important changes were the ones that couldn't be measured in headlines or congressional testimony. The man who had driven away from Prairie View 3 months earlier had been broken in ways that went far deeper than the official records could capture. 6 years of carrying guilt that wasn't his, shame that had been manufactured, and isolation that had been imposed rather than chosen, had left him hollowed out, going through the motions of civilian life without really living. But the man who now prepared to testify before Congress about the systematic corruption that had destroyed his career was someone different entirely. The truth had not just vindicated him, it had transformed him. Dr. Amanda Foster had noticed the change immediately when Marcus had returned to Kansas after his initial meetings with congressional investigators. During their first session after his public revelation, she had remarked on how different he seemed, how the tension that had defined his posture for years had been replaced by something she could only describe as purposeful calm. The nightmares hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had changed in character, becoming less frequent and less paralyzing when they did occur. "You're carrying yourself differently," she had observed during one of their sessions, "not just physically, but emotionally. It's as if you finally stopped fighting yourself and started fighting for yourself." Marcus had nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. For 6 years, his energy had been consumed by an internal battle against doubt, guilt, and confusion that had no resolution because it was based on false premises. Now that energy was directed outward, toward a cause that gave meaning to everything he had endured. The fight for truth and accountability wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about ensuring that other veterans wouldn't suffer the same betrayal he had experienced. The congressional hearings had begun quietly, with closed-door sessions where Marcus had provided detailed testimony about his final deployment and the circumstances of his discharge. The committee members had listened with a mixture of fascination and horror as he had described how intelligence had been manipulated, how his mission had been deliberately compromised, and how the subsequent investigation had been designed to find a scapegoat rather than seek the truth. Colonel Mitchell had corroborated his account with documentary evidence that left no doubt about the systematic nature of the deception. But it was the public testimony that had really captured the nation's attention. When Marcus had walked into the packed hearing room and placed his hand on the Bible to be sworn in, he had felt the weight of not just his own story, but the stories of countless other veterans who had been failed by the system they had served. The cameras had captured every word, as he had methodically dismantled the official narrative of his discharge, presenting evidence that revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the military intelligence community. The impact had been immediate and dramatic. Within hours of his testimony, news organizations were running in-depth investigations into other suspicious discharges and questionable intelligence operations. Veterans advocacy groups were demanding comprehensive reviews of administrative separations, and military lawyers were reaching out to former service members who had been processed out of the system under similar circumstances. Marcus's story had given permission for others to come forward with their own experiences of betrayal and abandonment. But perhaps the most significant response had come from within the military itself. Active duty personnel had begun reaching out through secure channels, sharing information about ongoing operations that raised similar concerns about intelligence manipulation and scapegoating. A network of whistleblowers had emerged, protected by new legislation that Marcus's testimony had helped inspire, creating a mechanism for reporting corruption without fear of retaliation. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Connor had been one of the first to contact Marcus after his congressional testimony. The call had come late one evening, as Marcus was preparing for another day of meetings with investigators and advocacy groups. O'Connor's voice had been thick with emotion, as he had apologized for not supporting Marcus during his darkest days, for accepting the official story without question, for allowing a fellow veteran to suffer in isolation. "I should have known," O'Connor had said. "You were the best officer I ever served under, and I should have known that something wasn't right about how everything ended. I failed you, and I failed myself by not asking the hard questions." Marcus had been gracious in accepting the apology, understanding that O'Connor, like so many others, had been operating with incomplete information. The conspiracy had been designed to be convincing, crafted by people who understood how to manipulate institutional loyalty and personal relationships to achieve their goals. The real villains were not the people who had believed the lies, but the people who had created them. The criminal trials that followed had provided a public forum for exposing the full scope of the corruption that had destroyed Marcus's career. Former Colonel William Drake, the architect of the Phoenix base deception, had been convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy to obstruct justice, falsification of military records, and violation of his oath of office. His testimony during the sentencing phase had revealed additional details about how intelligence had been systematically manipulated to serve political rather than operational purposes. Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Stone, who had overseen Marcus's discharge proceedings, had pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for cooperation with investigators. His testimony had exposed a network of officials who had been willing to sacrifice individual careers to protect institutional interests, a culture of cover-up that had infected multiple levels of the military bureaucracy. But for Marcus, the most satisfying moment had come when Paul Newman, the civilian administrator who had first suggested that accepting discharge would be in his best interest, had been arrested on charges of criminal conspiracy. Newman's emails, uncovered during the investigation, had revealed the calculating nature of the campaign to silence Marcus, including discussions about how to discredit him if he ever tried to challenge the official narrative. The financial settlement that eventually emerged from the civil litigation had been substantial, enough to provide Marcus with security for the rest of his life and fund the Veterans Advocacy Foundation he had established. But the money had never been the point. What mattered was the acknowledgement that he had been wronged, the validation of his service, and the changes that were being implemented to prevent similar betrayals from occurring in the future. The foundation that Marcus had created with the settlement funds had become his new mission, a way to channel his experience into meaningful change for other veterans. Based in Kansas City, the organization provided legal support for service members facing questionable discharge proceedings, advocacy for intelligence oversight reform, and counseling services for veterans dealing with institutional betrayal. The foundation's staff included other veterans who had been failed by the system, creating a community of people who understood both the cost of service and the price of seeking justice. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had left her position in military public affairs to join the foundation as its executive director, had brought credibility and connections that amplified its impact. Her insider knowledge of how military bureaucracy worked, combined with her commitment to transparency and accountability, had made the foundation a respected voice in policy discussions about military justice and veterans' rights. The foundation's first major success had been the passage of the Veterans Truth and Accountability Act, legislation that established new procedures for reviewing questionable discharges and created an independent ombudsman to investigate complaints of institutional misconduct. The bill had been signed into law in a ceremony that Marcus had attended, sitting in the Rose Garden as the president had acknowledged the sacrifice and courage required to expose the corruption that had made such legislation necessary. But beyond the policy victories and institutional changes, Marcus had found something even more valuable, a sense of purpose that gave meaning to everything he had endured. The work of the foundation connected him daily with veterans who were fighting their own battles against bureaucratic indifference and institutional betrayal. Each case they took on, each reform they advocated for, each veteran they helped, represented a victory not just for that individual, but for the principles that had motivated Marcus's original decision to serve. The personal transformation had been equally profound. Marcus had reconnected with his ex-wife Sarah, not romantically, but as friends who could finally understand what had gone wrong in their marriage. She had followed his congressional testimony and the subsequent revelations with a mixture of vindication and sorrow, understanding for the first time why their relationship had been poisoned by guilt and anger that she had never been able to comprehend. "I always knew you weren't the person they made you out to be," she had told him during one of their conversations. "But I didn't know how to fight something I couldn't understand. I'm proud of what you've done, of how you've turned your pain into purpose." Marcus had also begun speaking at military academies and officer training programs, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the importance of institutional integrity and individual courage. His presentations always emphasized that serving one's country sometimes meant challenging the very institutions that claimed to represent it. That true patriotism required the willingness to demand that those institutions live up to their highest ideals. The speech that had perhaps meant the most to him had been delivered at the Air Force Academy, standing before an auditorium full of young cadets who reminded him of who he had been decades earlier. As he had looked out at their eager faces, he had seen his own younger self, full of idealism and certainty about the righteousness of service and the honor of military life. "Your oath is to the Constitution, not to any individual or institution," he had told them. "There will come times in your careers when those two loyalties conflict, when you are asked to choose between following orders and following your conscience. In those moments, remember that the greatest service you can provide to your country is to ensure that its military remains worthy of the trust that has been placed in it." The standing ovation that had followed had been more meaningful to Marcus than any medal or commendation he had received during his active duty career. These young officers represented the future of military service, and their response suggested that his story had resonated, that the lessons learned from his experience might help prevent future betrayals. The media attention that had followed Marcus's revelations had eventually died down, replaced by new stories and fresh scandals that captured public attention. But the work continued, the foundation continued to grow, and the reforms continued to be implemented. Major David Kim, the investigation officer who had helped expose the Phoenix base conspiracy, had been promoted and assigned to head a new Office of Military Justice Oversight, bringing the perspective of someone who had seen how the system could be corrupted and was committed to preventing it from happening again. Tech Sergeant Carlos Rivera, who had discovered the critical evidence that had blown the case wide open, had been recognized for his courage and integrity, receiving promotions and assignments that reflected his value to a military community that was slowly learning to reward truth-telling rather than punish it. His example had inspired other technical specialists to come forward with evidence of wrongdoing, creating a culture where integrity was valued over institutional convenience. On a crisp morning in late spring, Marcus stood at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., reading the names etched into the black granite wall. He had come to the memorial often during his months of congressional testimony and advocacy work, finding solace in the recognition that his struggles were part of a much larger story of service and sacrifice that stretched back through generations of American military personnel. Ranger sat quietly beside him, the dog's presence, a reminder of how far they had both come since those dark days in Prairie View, when the future had seemed hopeless and the past unbearable. The service dog had been trained to help Marcus cope with the symptoms of trauma and anxiety, but he had evolved into something more, a companion who had witnessed the transformation from victim to advocate, from isolation to purpose. As Marcus traced the name of a helicopter pilot who had died in Vietnam, he thought about the courage required to serve in a system that was imperfect, that was capable of both great nobility and terrible betrayal. The men and women whose names were inscribed on this wall had served despite knowing the risks, had trusted their leaders despite understanding that those leaders were human and therefore fallible. Their sacrifice had meaning not because the system was perfect, but because they had chosen to serve ideals that were larger than any individual or institution. A young Army captain approached, recognizing Marcus from his congressional testimony and media appearances. The officer introduced himself as someone who had been inspired by Marcus's story to report misconduct in his own unit, action that had led to investigations and reforms that had improved conditions for enlisted personnel. "I wanted to thank you," the captain said, his voice sincere and respectful. "What you did gave the rest of us permission to speak up when we saw things that were wrong. You showed us that serving our country sometimes means challenging the people who claim to speak for it." Marcus shook the young officer's hand, feeling a sense of continuity that connected his own struggles to the ongoing effort to make military service worthy of the sacrifices it demanded. The captain's courage in reporting misconduct was part of the same tradition that had motivated Marcus's decision to expose the Phoenix Base conspiracy, a tradition that valued truth over convenience and integrity over institutional loyalty. As the sun set over the Potomac River, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Marcus of Afghanistan, he felt a profound sense of completion. The journey from that dusty compound where his military career had ended to this moment of recognition and purpose had been longer and more difficult than he could have imagined. But it had also been transformative, not just for him, but for the thousands of veterans whose lives had been touched by the reforms and advocacy work that had emerged from his courage to speak truth to power. The anonymous note that had first brought him to the ceremony at Whitman Air Force Base had promised that the truth about Phoenix Base deserved to be heard. That promise had been kept, but the real victory was not the exposure of past wrongs, but the creation of systems and safeguards that would prevent future betrayals. Marcus Thompson had not just reclaimed his own honor, he had helped restore honor to the institutions he had served, ensuring that future generations of service members would be protected by the same courage that had once been used against him. Walking away from the memorial with Ranger at his side, Marcus felt the weight of his service dog's presence and the lightness of a burden finally lifted. The fight for truth and justice would continue, but now it was being waged by many people in many places, a network of advocates and reformers who understood that preserving democracy sometimes required challenging its institutions. The transformation was complete, not just of one man's story but of the system itself, shaped by the courage of someone who had refused to let his silence be purchased with his complicity. The prairie wind that had once carried the scent of wheat and the promise of endless horizons now carried something else. The satisfaction of a mission completed, a wrong made right, and a future made more secure by the willingness of one person to stand up and demand that the truth be heard. Captain Marcus Thompson had finally come home. Not to a place but to a purpose that would sustain him for the rest of his life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.